Well, I think as a researcher, we're always sort of chasing originality. So being creative means being original, being able to think of something that no one's thought of before, or make connections that no one else has before. So being creative in a linguistic or language sense. I think I did learn at school. I wasn't very creative in terms of art or design and those type of subjects, but I was more creative when it came to English and creative writing and even writing in history. I would be able to be creative in a different sense, I think. And I think on my own, probably from reading a lot of fiction and non-fiction, um, was able to think more creatively.
So, what do you think it is that distinguishes those who find it very easy to be creative in their writing, for example, and those who find it a struggle? Do you think it's like a talent that some people are naturally talented in being creative linguistically, or do you think it's a skill that can be learnt?
Um, I think it can be a bit of both. I think the more that I read, the more I acquire sort of different phrases or different ways of writing, and I can think and write more creatively as a result. I think I've always tried to write creatively and as clearly and coherently as possible. Um, yeah, I think it can be something that's learned, but it also requires you to have some creative faculties and be inquisitive as well.
Okay, so being inquisitive, is that like being curious, like a desire to discover, a desire to explore? Is that what you mean by being inquisitive?
Yes, so I always read with a question in mind, or I have a particular topic or theme in mind I'm reading. So I'm trying to understand what's being said, but also how it relates to what I'm interested in, and being curious as to what a particular author has, what their particular take is on something. Um, well, at the moment, there's not a lot of attention being paid to ethnic minority voting behavior in the referendum. A lot of the more dominant explanations look at support for right-wing populism more generally, and it's more of a focus on white voters or white male voters in particular. So I'm thinking creatively about how different groups of from backgrounds related to the referendum. So there's not a lot of sort of research out there, so I'm having to um, make guesses based on different group priorities, and um, yeah, I'm having to be sort of creative in some senses.
And in what way is that easy, and in what way is that a struggle for you, Neema?
It's difficult that there isn't more research in this area yet, but it's also quite exciting to sort of bring my own reading and my own perspective on it and be creative in a sense in how minority and political participation is understood with Brexit and more recent political context of UKIP and support for right-wing populism. So the only times that I have sort of um, engagement with my work outside of my supervisors is at conference presentations. So aside from what my supervisors of my work, doing presentations, doing PowerPoints. I like to use a lot of images for example, the Operation Black Vote poster on Brexit, which had an Asian woman in a sari opposite a white skinhead tattooed man on a seesaw. And it says a vote is a vote, and it says a lot about the assumptions about Brexit and who is voting Leave or Remain. There also have been particular artistic depictions of the idea of Scotland and men being left behind by globalization and immigration, and those kind of dominant Brexit in a creative sense. So yeah, so the image is to relay what are the more dominant assumptions, and I don't think there exist many assumptions. I mean, many images to the contrary.
Okay. So in that respect, how do you envisage your creativity in filling that gap where those images don't exist presently?
So what I'll be doing with my fieldwork is getting testimonies of different groups of Remain and voters, really be able to use images, but in terms of using their words and their testimonies to sort of new perspectives, positive in how I present those views. But I think it's fairly uncharted territory, so I can be creative in how I present that.
In terms of your positioning in this research that you're doing, um, what do you see yourself as being positioned in the mainstream, or do you see yourself being positioned on the margins?
I think it really how I look at it in the field of uh, sort of studies of political participation and voting behavior in particular. I think ethnicity is seen as sort of add-on rather than it's not a central focus. So voting studies is quite sort of some senses. I think ethnicity doesn't get the same intention or importance that it deserves, so it can be on the margins in that sense. Also, as a person, a woman of color, feel like I'm not really part of the mainstream in terms of academia. Usually, people who work in this area tend to be older white men.
Right. So it's it seems as though, tell me if I'm right or wrong, but it seems as though you're saying you're kind of not in the mainstream, because of who you are, you're not like the typical person who would be researching this. So do you think that that kind of leaves you in a position of marginality?
I think it can, but it also depends on how I sort of negotiate that space, and how I sort of carry myself in those spaces. And I think it's not necessarily a level playing field, but I have to sort of work hard to um, put my research forward, whether it's in the form of blog posts or giving presentations at these conferences, and trying to sort of assert my relevance, or the relevance of my research at least.
So, in what way would your research gain credibility and recognition for being creative in the mainstream space?
So what I refer to as a mainstream space would be the the academic space of studying politics. Um, what I've found is that ethnicity and race and studies of race uh, are what I feel are taken sociology, but not much when and I think uh, sorry, what was your question again?
Yes, it was in terms of, gaining recognition within the space of mainstream rather than the space of the margins. So it's about gaining recognition for your creativity in the mainstream rather than in the margins.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I think at some point research will speak for itself, hopefully, in terms of adding something new to the existing understandings on um, voting behaviour and why people voted for Brexit in particular.
So, why people voted for Brexit, but you're focusing on the ethnic votes, not voted against?
Um, yes, so I'm interested in how ethnic identity influence people's votes. So I'm also looking at white identity and whiteness, um, and how that influenced people voting Remain or Leave, as well as people from other ethnic minority backgrounds, and how that factored in their decision making.
Okay, yes. I suppose that's an important point to clarify that when you're talking about ethnicity, you're not you're not just focusing on certain types of ethnicity. You're focusing on ethnicity in general.
Mm-hmm.
So will you also
That's
be
right.
yeah? So will you also be interviewing? Well, what kind of people will you be interviewing in terms of ethnicity? Because it's so vast. It can be massive, can't it? It can be huge. So in terms of ethnicity, what are the different groups that you will be interviewing?
So I'm going to be looking at the five main groups in Britain who were eligible to vote in the referendum. So that includes Asian, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Black Caribbean and Black African. And that also and I'll also be interviewing people who identify as white, whether that's white British or white English or Welsh. Actually, sorry, my research will be taking place in Birmingham, so there might not be as many people who identify as white Scottish or white Welsh. Um, I'm not really sure at this point. I think I'm having some trouble recruiting currently because it's a sensitive topic. Asking about how people voted. The referendum was, as we're aware, was very divisive. So I think in terms of my output and how it's received or recognized, there might be some uncomfortable truths for people.